Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lee Silverman. I'm one of the three members of the 4HistoryBuffs Planning Committee, and it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to Sophia Etier, who will present on Western Montana's African American community. This is her second appearance here recently. A year or two ago, she gave one on the red light districts of Missoula and Hamilton. So we're pleased to have her back. And I just remembered a minute ago to turn off my cell phone, so I hope you all do that too, so we don't interrupt her talk. If you have yet to grab one of our flyers, we have one more program. It'll be coming on June 24th. It's called Soaking Up the History of Montana's Hot Springs Resorts by Jeff Birkby. I'm sorry, yes, it's May, yes, oh my goodness. Thank you for correcting me. We have in May the land surveyor's interpretation of the history of the Missoula property development by Bill, I don't know how to pronounce it, Weichel? Okay, I guess he's here. I'm sorry I blew that, thinking there was only one more month in our 6 months plan. So it'll be on, Bill's program will be on May 27th, and then the hot springs will be on June 24th. So I'm sorry about that omission. Thank you for correcting me, Paulette. So if you don't have one of our flyers, we have some over there on the table. Be sure to grab one. And we also have them on the library's website. So for much of Western Montana's history, the story of the region's African American communities has been one that was dominated by the legacy of Buffalo soldiers. Recent research, however, has uncovered that the African American communities in Hamilton and Missoula contributed significantly to the urban landscape and the local histories between 1870 to 1940, as you see on the screen there. So for the first time, here are their collective stories. And take it away, Sophia. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Hello, and thank you so much for coming tonight. Obviously, my name is Sophia Etier, and I am a PhD student at the University of Montana studying anthropology, specifically cultural heritage. My research specializes in the minority communities in the American West between 1865 and 1945. But more specifically, I study the minority communities of Missoula and the Bitter Valley, particularly in Hamilton. Now, one of the questions that I pose in all my talks is, what did Montana demographically look like between the late 19th century and early 20th century? In order to understand diversity in the American West, we must first understand the demographics. Now, these are Montana state demographics between 1870 and 1890. We can see that our black population actually grew from 0.9% in 1870 to 1.1% of the state population by 1890. So ranging from 183 citizens to 1,490 citizens. Now, our black population expands significantly during this 20-year period following the arrival of our Buffalo Soldier units. So those are our 24th and 25th Infantries and our 9th and 10th U.S. Cavalries. Now, I will talk about their stories in a little bit, but that is why we see such a significant increase. Now, looking at our Asian Pacific Islander population, we see that our population in 1870 is a booming 9.5%, but within that same 20-year time frame, we drop to only 1.9% of the population. Now, this is due to our Asian communities declining significantly due to racial legislation that takes place between 1870 and 1885. Now, the two legislative acts that particularly take place at this time are the 1875 Page Act that prohibits the immigration of Asian women to the United States, as it was deemed that they were only coming to the United States for purposes of prostitution, and also the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically limited Chinese laborers from coming into the United States to obtain labor positions. Now, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was supposed to be taking place between 1882 and 1892, so for only 10 years. But it did get extended in 1892 and 1902, and the act itself would actually not be repealed until after World War II. Now, these are our Montana state populations between 1900 and 1920. So we can see in 1900, we have a continually decreasing Black population from 0.8% of the population in 1900, and by 1920, we only have a state Black population of 0.2%. As Jim Crow laws escalated segregation, Montana's Black populations began to dwindle as communities sought safety and refuge in larger communities in states like California and New York. Now, looking at our Asian population as well, between 1900 and 1920, we dropped from 0.7% to 0.2%. Now, this is specifically looking at the Chinese population at this point, as Chinese and Japanese immigrants are separated. Now, our Chinese demographic declines due to racial prejudice and segregation following these legislative acts that I mentioned earlier. So as you can see with our demographics, we really are working with a minority percent of the population. For example, in 1900, we have a white population of 98%, but by 1920, it's 97.3%. So quite literally, these are our state minority populations. Now, how was Western Montana's Black community accessing the West? Now, we do talk about how they were restricted in the American West, but we should also talk about how they were accessing the West. Now, there are several acts and amendments that allowed Black communities following the end of the Civil War to make their way west, particularly the 1862 Homestead Act and the 1909 Enlarged Homestead Act. Now, Black families utilized the 1862 and 1909 Homestead Acts to make their way west, starting first in Nebraska and Kansas, before eventually ending up in places like Montana and Wyoming before the end of the boom in 1920. Now, it's thought by 1920, the homestead boom ended and no homesteading families were making their way to Montana. This is when produce corporations began buying homesteads and increasing corporate farms in Montana. Now, this period of time is often referred to as the Great Migration or the Invisible Migration. Now, this is an example of a Black homesteading family from Wyoming. One of the stipulations of the Homesteading Act was that a house or structure had to sit on the property and contain at least one window and one door to prove residency, which was checked regularly. There are many oral histories stating that many homesteading towns had one window that would be passed between community members as homesteading checks occurred. So when one home was checked, the window would be taken out and it would be ran to the next home. And so this is how we also see that community is established in homesteaded communities as well. Now, when specifically talking about Western Montana, as I do particularly study Missoula and Hamilton, we actually see domestic migration populations travel between Black communities, moving between cities like Helena, Deer Lodge, and Missoula. Now, all of these cities exhibited Black communities between 1870 and 1940, and we do see numerous individuals moving between each city. Now, these are some of the earliest examples of Black individuals who made their way to Montana, starting roughly by about 1870, moving through about 1875. Many of you have probably heard of stagecoach Mary Fields. She actually was born in Tennessee in 1832 and made her way up to Great Falls, eventually passing away in 1914. Stagecoach Mary Fields was actually known for working with the Postal Service and has many legends attached to her history. We see Agnes Annie Morgan, born in 1833 in Maryland and dying in 1914 in Phillipsburg, Montana. She actually made her way west with the 7th Cavalry. If you're familiar with the 7th Cavalry, that is Custer's unit. Now, we also have Sarah Gammon Brown Bickford. She was born in 1856 in Tennessee and eventually would make her way to Virginia City, owning the Virginia City Water Company, and she would pass away in 1931. Now, these individuals largely sought Montana out for the autonomy and independence available to them for some of the first times. Now, we're going to kind of dive into Missoula's Black heritage first. Now, as I mentioned before, the arrival of Montana's Buffalo Soldiers established permanent Black communities in the region over the course of the next 50 years, starting in 1888. These communities were settled by Buffalo soldiers, often who retired and raised their families in cities like Missoula and Hamilton. Now, Missoula witnessed a large population boom of African American citizens after the racially segregated Buffalo Soldier units, particularly the 25th Infantry, were stationed and headquartered at Fort Missoula. Now, for only a 10-year period between 1888 and 1898, several cities in western Montana became home to these Buffalo Soldiers, including Helena with Fort Harrison, Miles City with Fort Keogh, and Great Falls with Fort Shaw. Now, prior to being stationed in western Montana, these units moved throughout the American South, making their way westward, first to Fort Davis in Texas, and then up to Fort Snelling in Minnesota. But significant time was spent in Louisiana, Alabama, Texas, North and South Dakota, and Wyoming. Now, these units were nicknamed Buffalo Soldiers reportedly by Plains tribes, as the 25th was primarily utilized during peacetime mediation efforts between U.S. Army units, incoming settlers, and indigenous tribes throughout the Indian Wars period. Now, I do say peacetime efforts with quotations. Now, the 25th Infantry was mobilized throughout the Northwest outside of their time in Montana to quell several labor strikes in the early 1890s, and they also conducted the famous Bicycle Corps journey in 1897. But by 1898, the Spanish-American War had started, and the 25th was actually mustered out to fight in places like Cuba and the Philippines. Now, we do have other ways that the 25th Infantry was involved in the community. It was said that parades were not complete without the 25th Infantry Band. We can see the 25th Infantry Band practicing on the parade grounds of Fort Missoula. Many Missoulians crowded baseball fields to watch the 25th baseball team compete against local and state teams, as well as compete in matches with national Black teams. And we can also see what I think is just a very interesting photo of a Bicycle Corps member with an elephant right in front of the depot, the Northern Pacific Railway depot right out by our X's. So it's crazy to think that an elephant was at the depot at one point, but it's also very interesting to think about the journey of the Bicycle Corps. Now, testing the effectiveness of the Spalding bicycle for Army transport, Fort Missoula tasked 20 Buffalo Soldiers from the 25th to ultimately ride from Missoula to St. Louis in the summer of 1897. The 20 were pre-selected for their height, weight, and skill. They completed the arduous journey, and the bike was actually never utilized for Army transport. Now, a little background, the Buffalo Soldiers did do 2 trial runs in 1896. They went up to Glacier, and they also went down to Yellowstone, where this famous photo was taken at Mammoth Hot Springs. Now, I should also mention that this journey was arduous for many reasons. First of all being, these are incredibly heavy steel bikes. Now, it's estimated that the bikes alone weighed 50 pounds. That's not taking into account gear, rations, and change of uniform. This is also not taking into account the weight that was added to the singular bicycle mechanic that went along this journey. So he had a separate 25-pound box that was put on the top of his bike. I should also mention that these bikes would not have been very comfortable. They were steel seats with no cushioning. And additionally, they had to ride these bicycles through the hot summer sun of 1897. Now, their food and supplies would be dropped off at depots along the way, and if they missed their drop-off date, they would have to ride to the next depot to get supplies there. We do see reports of alkaline poisoning in Nebraska, but we do see the Buffalo Soldiers make their way to St. Louis. And while this is a large part of the Buffalo Soldiers' legacy in Montana, it is not the only part of the Buffalo Soldiers' legacy. Now, one of the things that I'm most interested to talk about is the St. Paul AME Church. Between 1909 and 1938, the St. Paul AME Church not only provided Missoula's Black community with a safe place of worship, but also provided the population a safe community center as well. Now, this church was once located at 1427 Phillips Street, and this church served Missoula's North Side residents, who largely were comprised of 24th and 25th Infantry veterans who chose to settle down in the city. Now, some veterans came back with the 25th after fighting in battles like the Battle of San Juan Hill with Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. And between 1902 and 1905, the 24th took garrison at Fort Missoula. Now, the church was known for hosting several popular social events such as religious conferences, Black heritage socials, choir jubilees, chicken dinners, ice cream socials, and summer barbecues. Now, typical barbecues included beef, chicken, pork or lamb, buttered bread, coleslaw, pickles, sliced tomatoes, watermelon. Most of their watermelon actually was brought in from Georgia. Water, coffee, and ice cream. Now, typically, these barbecues would be held from 11 a.m. to 9 p.m., so they were serving food all day. Oftentimes, the proceeds for these barbecues would go back into the church, but in 1925, the barbecue served 443 pounds of steer, 50 pounds of pork, and 30 pounds of lamb. Now, this was to over 300 guests, which resulted in $138, and which was given to a young blind boy named Joe Bartholomew, who was able to then travel to Butte for restorative eye surgery. So we do see that these barbecues were not just beneficial for the church, but is one of the ways that the church gave back to the community. Now, throughout the 1920s, they hosted several of these barbecues in Greeno Park, but they would also showcase baseball games. So we do see that usually some of the baseball games that were played in Greeno Park, the winner of those baseball games would play in an exhibition match against a city team. Now, we do see that some of the picnics did serve over 500 guests. One of the men behind the grill was actually this man, the third man in the row. His name was James Robert Mudd. Now, this picture was taken in the 1920s and published by the Missoulian, and this is the only photo I've ever found of James Mudd. Now, Mudd was one of the most notable members of the AME congregation. He served at every barbecue, and he was one of the several cooks for the annual barbecues. Now, we also have the discovery of several cultural clubs. Now, one of the most popular cultural clubs for Missoula's Black community was the Hawthorne Club, which opened from 1901 to 1960. Now, throughout the duration of the infantry, the 24th Infantry's post at Fort Missoula, the Hawthorne Club acted as a civic center, often hosting New Year's Eve parties and Christmas parties. Now, the Hawthorne Club went by many names, including the Rocky Mountain Colored Club and the Missoulian, but we know it as the Hawthorne Club, and it was located in Missoula's restricted district in the middle of the Chinese community, and was actually at one point located where the VFW is today on West Main Street. So we do see that the Hawthorne Club moves to several different places in Missoula, starting near where Stockman's is located today on Upper West Front Street. They then moved to where the VFW is located today for quite some time, and then they actually end back on West Front Street in the Gleim buildings. Now, between 1912 and 1916, the club was closed by Commissioner William Houston, who claimed that the club had violated City Ordinance number 323. Now, he claimed that they violated this ordinance in June of 1912, but the ordinance was only passed in April of 1912. And it was claimed that this was a saloon acting under the guise of a club without a liquor license. Now, the Hawthorne Club was eventually transitioned from being viewed as a rowdy bar to an elegant jazz club in the 40s and 50s. Now, the ownership of the club passed between several of the city's notable Black residents, including George Lucas and Joe Johnson. One of the longest-standing owners would be a man named Eddie Joyner. And upon Joyner's death in 1960, we see the Hawthorne Club close. Now, I do have two advertisements for the Hawthorne Club that were published by the Missoulian. And I think my favorite is being where the best people meet. I think that speaks of volumes about the Hawthorne Club. Now, we also have another cultural club. One of the other cultural clubs was the Black Masonics Lodge, established in 1921, located at 113 West Front Street. It was actually established by a Black Mason who came over from Spokane to open the lodge. Now, Solomon Dorsey and William Johnson were some of the earliest officers in the lodge, Dorsey actually being from the 10th Cavalry, and William Johnson being from the 25th Infantry. Now, part of our Black history in Missoula as well is the restricted communities. Now, these communities were ostracized by conservative ideologies and racial prejudices of the 19th and 20th centuries, with several Missoula's Black population finding themselves living within one of the city's three restricted districts. We see Parker's Island, established in 1865, running through 1910. That was once located where Kiwanis and Bess Reed Park are today along the Clark Fork River. We have the largest restricted community, which was West Front Street, established in 1888, being shut down in 1917. And then we also have the Cold Springs District, established roughly in 1889, running through 1906. Now, we'll talk about the Cold Springs District in a minute, and I probably need to find a better landmark to tell you where the Cold Springs District is, but if you go to Walmart on your way into the Bitterroot Valley, the Walmart sits on top of where the district was. And I always make the joke with my tour guests that I use Walmart as landmarks, and that's very much the case. Now, research has uncovered that the Cold Springs District, located up Miller Creek, just on the outskirts of Fort Missoula, was the region's first known predominantly African-American populated restricted district. Now, the Cold Springs District was publicly known for violence, with high rates of assault and homicide between 25th Infantry soldiers. Now, one of the most notable incidents of the Cold Springs District occurred in October 19, 1897, when Private Elias King of Company G killed Private Edward Bolton of Company H in proclaimed self-defense after a game of cards turned sour. Now, Bolton was given a formal military burial in the Fort Missoula Post Cemetery, but almost a century later, in the 1980s, his headstone was found buried over 6 miles away in the upper Rattlesnake Creek area underneath a garden nursery. So we can see the Missoulian publication that shows Bolton's headstone in the Rattlesnake. At this time, we don't know how it got up there or how long it had been located there, but I can confirm that it is back in the Post Cemetery where it belongs. Now, a little more information on the Cold Springs District. It's estimated to have been established right around the 1889 mark after the arrival of the 25th Infantry to Fort Missoula. Now, the first mention of the Cold Springs District occurred in November of 1896 after a domestic dispute occurred between a black man named George Smith and his wife, Mary. Now, the November 1896 article mentions that many of the brothels and saloons in the restricted district were frequently visited by the 25th Infantry, particularly black saloon proprietor Richard Birney's 4 Mile House. Now, recent research has also recovered that most of the altercations occurred between Company G of the 25th Infantry. Now, this picture is not of the Cold Springs District. This is taken of Missoula right around the same time the Cold Springs District would have existed. That's actually the post hospital. Now, the Cold Spring District, as I mentioned, had a reputation for being so rowdy between the brothels and saloons that the U.S. Army threatened to remove Fort Missoula entirely if the district was not absolved. Missoula City Commissioners decided that all liquor licenses would be revoked from the district saloons, and the district eventually collapsed and disappeared by 1906. There were many reports that said soldiers who were paid on Friday would go to the Cold Springs District by Saturday and end up in the post hospital on Sunday. We do see an officer of the 7th Infantry actually shot in the ear, and another officer had his thumb bitten off trying to break up a fight in the Cold Springs District. Now, moving on to Hamilton's Black heritage. Hamilton's Black community was primarily comprised in the city's restricted district. The district was comprised of 3 main demographic groups: African Americans, working women of all ethnicities, and Asian immigrants. Now, Hamilton had one distinct district ran at one time by at least 2 madams, Clara Smith and Mary Gleim. Now, Clara Smith did marry a private from the 25th Infantry, and Mary Gleim was the notorious Madam of West Front Street in Missoula. I should mention, though, that the bulk of the restricted district in Hamilton was actually located where the post office is today. So not a Walmart, but a post office. Now, Clara would be the only madam left in Hamilton after a mysterious red light district fire occurred in October of 1908 that ran Mary Gleim back to Missoula. And now I say mysterious, as the red light fire occurred after a failed city council meeting where city council attempted to eradicate the red light district. Now, red light districts at this time were known for contributing significant amounts of money to civic coffers through property taxes, construction fees, liquor licenses, and so Western economies essentially depended upon the existence of these red light districts to thrive. Now, the city council failed to eradicate the district, and at 2 in the morning following the council meeting, the entire red light district was on fire. Now, these were primarily buildings owned by Mary Gleim, and they were primarily wood frame buildings that lit up very quickly. Now, an oral history conducted in the 1980s by the Bitterroot Valley Historical Society excuse me, cites that the Smith's Black Diamond brothel was the only remaining building in the district by 1910. Now, the Black Diamond stood just off of Main Street until its demolition at the end of the 20th century. And Hamilton's red light district comprised the Bitterroot Valley's largest African-American population. Now, the Black Diamond once stood behind where Chapter 1 bookstore is located today. And as you can see in this Sanborn Fire Insurance map, we have the Black Diamond circled right on that second block. That does indicate that it was a 2-story brick building, FB standing for Female Boarding House, or brothel as it was designated on the Sanborn Fire Insurance maps. And we can also see that it was located in front of a saloon. Now, several saloons in Hamilton and throughout the Bitterroot Valley were burned between 1910 and 1915 as part of the Anti-Saloon League's campaign in favor of Montana entering Prohibition. Now, Montana would be the first state to vote to go into Prohibition in 1916 and not fully enact Prohibition until 1918. But we do know that at one time, Hamilton had 25 different saloons that were eventually condensed down to 7. It was said that a vote for the Anti-Saloon League was a vote for God. Now, this is Hamilton's very own Buffalo Soldier. Henry Smith was born on February 15th, 1857 in Stevenson, Alabama to unknown parents. He is currently believed to come from an enslaved family given record, region, and era. Now, Smith would serve 3 enlistments with the 25th Infantry, re-enlisting in 1884 at Fort Snelling, Minnesota, and in 1889 at Fort Missoula. Now, Henry Smith worked in various positions after retiring from the Army in 1890 and moving to Hamilton. He did work as a farmer, a cook, and obviously a brothel owner. Now, this is one of the Register of Enlistments in 1884. Smith is actually listed right here. Yes, right there. Now, during his time in Hamilton, it was reported that by the Raleigh Republic, that Smith had written a World War I patriotic poem that garnered local, state, and national fame, but this poem has not yet been located at this time. Now, Henry Smith did serve 11 years with the 25th Infantry and is designated as a Indian Wars veteran through and through. One of the few ways that Black Montanans can be tracked are vital records, so birth, marriage, and death records, military service forms, and property documents as well. Now, this particular form is Henry and Clara Smith's certificate from November 15th, 1889. It does list Henry living at Fort Missoula, and it does list Clara Smith as living in the Cold Springs district. Now, Clara Smith, born Clara Sarah Goffigan Smith, was born on Christmas Day, 1855 in Norfolk, Virginia. She is presumed to be the descendant of an enslaved population located on the Goffigan family plantation in Capeville or Northampton County, Virginia. We do know that her father, Spencer, is also listed as living in Capeville, Virginia in 1870, documented as an illiterate laborer. He died at the age of 80 in 1893, not leaving Northampton County. Now, Clara supposedly ran several wood frame boarding houses that serviced the Bitterroot's African-American population. But unfortunately, several of these lodging houses were burned down between 1908 and 1911. Now, unfortunately, at this time, fires were not uncommon in Black communities. Unfortunately, many properties and buildings were maliciously burned down. Now, we do know that the Smiths also had an agricultural property located just outside Corvallis in the Bitterroot Valley, and that was also burned to the ground. Now, between her birth and her marriage to Henry, nothing is known of Clara's life. Some theorize that she came to Montana as a cook for the Daly family while living in Butte during a previous marriage. As you can see on their wedding certificate, Clara is actually listed as Clara Vance. Now, I have not been able to find an additional marriage certificate for Clara, so it is still theory at this point how she actually came to Montana. Some theorize that her previous marriage was actually a marriage to one of the barbers for the Daly family. Now, this is an 1870 Northampton County census, which shows Clara's father, Spencer, still living near the Goffigan family. So the providing white family, the white Goffigan family, is just listed right below Spencer and his wife, Mary. Now, the Goffigans were known as plantation owners and slave owners in Northampton County, Virginia. Moving on, we have Frank Gray. Frank Gray was born on October 10th, 1889 to Maddie Smith and Frank Gray in Nashville, Tennessee. Frank Gray belonged to the first generation of African Americans not directly impacted by slavery. Now, at the age of 20, Frank traveled from Tennessee to Montana to live with his cousin, Clara Smith. Now, on August 2nd, 1918, Gray answered the call to duty and enlisted in the United States Army to serve in World War I. First training at Camp Lewis in Washington, and eventually deploying with Company E of the 815th Pioneer Infantry on the USS Maui, leaving from Hoboken, New Jersey, arriving in northern France. Now, during this time, it was typical that African American units serving in World War I would be responsible for interring the dead on the battlefields, but actually Gray's unit was responsible for repairing transport roads with the First Army engineers. Now, Frank did live in Hamilton from 1919 to his death in 1936, and was known by many as Phoebe rather than Frank. Frank worked particularly as a janitor, a laborer, and a porter in many businesses in Hamilton. Now, he did die within 5 months of Clara Smith, and he was buried with full military honor in the Riverview Cemetery in Hamilton, including a bugler and a 21-gun salute attended by the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the VFW, and the Bitterroot chapter of the American Legion. Now, this is a picture of the USS Maui. This is arriving back to the U.S. in 1919. And this is also a brochure for Camp Lewis, which is now Joint Base Camp Lewis. Camp Lewis now operates as Joint Base Lewis McChord for the Army and the Air Force. This was the first military installation to be created by a citizen land gift. Now, I will say, if you do remember anybody from this presentation, Tish Nevins would be the person to remember. Now, Tish Nevins was born on the Nevins Plantation outside of Paris, Missouri on June 2nd, 1862, to an enslaved mother who was owned by Preacher Nevins and an unknown white man. Now, she went to work in the home of Robert and Martha Smythe in 1890 at the age of 28, acting eventually as an adopted mother to the Robert Smythe children following the death of Martha just 1 week after the birth of her 10th child. Now, Robert, Tish, and the Smythe children arrived to Hamilton by 1899. Following the marriage of the youngest Smythe child, Tish purchased an abandoned brothel and turned it into a restaurant and a boarding house. Now, Tish had several underprivileged children live and work for her so that she could pay for their public school education in Hamilton. She's often remembered as doing the most for the underprivileged and the underserved in the Bitterroot Valley. Now, furthering her love for children, Tish would adopt 5-year-old orphan Marjorie Chapin in 1915. But unfortunately, Marjorie would pass away at the age of 12 in 1922 due to complications from abdominal surgery. Now, Tish's Place was known far and wide. Tish's Place is listed as having visitors from throughout the United States, but including London, Paris, and Tokyo. Tish's meals were often presented on tables with crisp white linens and freshly picked wildflowers. And her meals typically consisted of 3 different types of meats, white and sweet potatoes, salads, sides, and desserts, including apple pie and sunshine cake. She was also known to work with several local business owners, particularly the Howe family that owned the Hamilton Creamery. It was said that they would donate cream and butter and cheese to Tish's restaurant, and after her famous Sunday chicken dinners, she would give the remnants of those chicken dinners back to the Howe family. It's also said that she worked with a black gardener in Hamilton to receive the freshest produce year-round. Now, at the time of Tish's death in 1942, her home was reported to be decorated floor to ceiling with holiday cards and pictures of the children that she helped raise throughout her life. So the children that she gave an education and ultimately a future to. Now, this is an advertisement for Tish's Place, published by the Rivali Republic. As you can see, located on 107 North 4th Street, so just opposite of the post office in Hamilton, with a Sunday special chicken dinner for $1.25. You could also rent the rooms in Tish's Place as well. I recently spoke to a group of high school students about Tish, and I asked them, could you buy chicken dinner for $1.25 today? And everyone said, man, I wish. Now, this is also Tish later in life. Her story was actually published very briefly by the Montana Historical Society. Now, it was said that Tish kept prices low, preferring word of mouth over cash. And like many black women in the West, Tish found autonomy and financial independence through restaurant ownership and really good fried chicken. Now, it was said that later in life, Tish moved out of the kitchen in the service area, where she would teach local women how to cook, how to bake, and, quote, how to season. Now, an underrepresented portion of Hamilton's black heritage actually stems from the Bitterroot stock farm. Now, between 1896 and 1900, Marcus Daly employed several black horse grooms and jockeys to work for the stock farm thoroughbred racing program. This would be the same thoroughbred racing program that would produce racers like Tammany, for which Tammany's Castle was built in Hamilton, as well as Scottish Chieftain. Now, by 1900, black jockeys would be banned from the horse racing world through the 1960s. Now, I have pulled the census from 1898 or 1890, and it does list several of the individuals. We do have Arthur Lewis, born in 1887 in Kentucky, James Hawkins, born in 1886 in Kentucky, James Hicks, born in 1886, and Daniel Johnson, born in 1885. Now, comparatively, if we think about these ages today, they range from 13 to 15. These young men would be roughly 8th graders or freshmen in high school working for Daly's stock farm. Now, this is the first time that their names are presented publicly, and I believe that they should be remembered alongside the rest of the stock farm history. Here is a Bitterroot stock farm ranch hands and laborers photo prior to 1900. Now, changing the narrative. I have been fortunate enough to work with several organizations to bring these stories to light, including the Downtown Missoula Partnership and the Ravalli County Museum, a partnership to tell the stories of all Montanans truthfully. Now, in 2023, we had the Carnal Enterprises tour released with the Downtown Missoula Partnership, specifically the Unseen Missoula program, that does discuss Missoula's red light district and the stories of its Chinese and African American inhabitants. We also had the Halloween special tour, Screams and Spirits, that goes on to discuss even more of these individuals' lives. And this year in 2025, we will have a historic Hamilton walking tour release that will explore the Hamilton red light district and incorporate permanently these stories. Now, changing the narrative allows our historic spaces to be representative of all that walked before us. Changing the narrative reflects all Montanans, allowing the forgotten to be remembered and for the lost to finally be found. Now, I do want to mention that May is National Historic Preservation Month, and so the Ravalli County Museum will be putting on a special debut tour of the red light district in Hamilton, talking about the city's Chinese population, the Japanese population, and also its African American community. And for Missoula, we will have several events with the Missoula Historic Preservation Office that incorporate many of these histories, including a free women's history walking tour on May 3rd, a free red light tour of Carnal Enterprises with the state Chinese historian Mark Johnson on the 10th. We will be exploring the Garden City history on May 17th with Vine Plant and Design. We'll have our annual Historic Preservation Awards at the Missoula County Fairgrounds on May 22nd. And then I will also be giving a talk at Cranky Sam's Public House on the Missoula Chinese community. Now, one thing that I do want to leave with this talk is that when we change the narrative, the remembered are not the forgotten. Thank you.
Saw that Tish Nevins, she had the kids working for her to pay for a public education. Did you pay by child back then, or do you have any information on that?
So Tish Nevins had the students work in her boarding house so that they could provide clothing, school books, those kinds of things. It was often said that they worked in the boarding house, but they never touched the dishes, as that was time for homework. So some of the profits from Tish's place would go towards the fees for the county public school system. So it was fees per child, but that gave the children a way so that they could be clothed, they could be fed regularly, and they could also receive education the same as any other child in Hamilton.
Thank you. And then Morgan Case Ranch, that must be the Annie Morgan on Rock Creek?
Yeah.
Okay, and she sold fish, and I'm guessing she just ended up in Phillipsburg in her older age?
Yeah, she eventually just moved to Phillipsburg, and that's where she did pass away.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you.
She moved throughout western Montana quite a bit before settling in Phillipsburg.
How good was their baseball team?
So they actually made news quite a bit. The 25th Infantry baseball team often played city teams in exhibition matches. Now, I will say the first year that they played an exhibition match, which I think was 1889, they lost 21-3, so not the best. But by 1898, when they would muster out, they were winning games against city teams or having games with close scores like 7-9. So they actually had a pretty regional reputation for being really skilled. We also see them taking on teams like the Butte Color Giants, which roamed around the region playing exhibition games and having pretty close matches as well. There was an individual on the baseball team who would actually be recruited to play locally and statewide. He was located in Hamilton for a year to play for the Hamilton City team. He was brought on to the McIntosh Reds for a while, which played in Missoula and Bonner. And there's a whole bunch of history on the 25th Infantry baseball team that I don't have time to go into, unfortunately, but they were really skilled. The band? What would have... Oh, there are so many reports about how outstanding the 25th Band was. There was a book just released on the 25th Infantry Band that Fort Missoula has, but they played at basically like every city parade, funerals, Easter parades, any sort of event that people were coming to, dances, the 25th Infantry was invited to. And so the picture of the 25th Infantry mustering out on Easter Sunday, 1898, actually does feature a portion of the marching band in front of it. So they were like the first contact that a lot of Missoulians had with the 25th Infantry.
I think that was Susan Hintz who wrote that book.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like a blue book.
Yeah. We have it at the library, advertised.
It's very interesting.
I was just curious if you had any more details about Frank being called Phoebe.
At this time, I don't. It's only listed once in his obituary, and I would love to discuss or research that more. I have not come across any oral histories or interviews that discuss that. He's not even mentioned in local history narratives until I found him on a census living with Henry and Clara. So he's definitely an individual that I want to research into more. So I apologize that I don't have information on that yet. But it did list in 2 separate newspapers that he went by Phoebe instead of Frank.
Any more questions?
On one of those death certificate, it said a place of birth, Arabia.
Yes, on Clara Smith's, yeah, her mother.
Oh, that's her mother.
Yeah.
Do you think that was real, or is somebody just
It definitely
mixed it
could
up
have
with
been.
Africa?
It definitely could have been. Unfortunately, on a lot of vital records for African Americans, we see this in Chinese communities as well, the information is not exactly correct. It's just either what was reported to them or the individual who was responsible for reporting that information didn't know and they just said something. I have not been able to find any record of Clara's mother.
You mentioned early in your presentation that the restricted districts where the African Americans lived were extremely violent. And I wondered to what extent the social economic pressures that were in existence at that time contributed to that kind of environment. And who was reporting on the violence? Was it the African Americans themselves, or was it the white-dominated journalism at that time?
So it was the white-dominated journalism by the Missoulian that was reporting on that. However, we do see very many accounts of, or death certificates of murder from individuals who were murdered within the Cold Springs district. The Cold Springs district was the most violent out of the three. I definitely do believe that socioeconomic pressures did play a part in that. We do see, though, that most of the violence that occurred in this district does occur between infantry members of the 25th, and the Company G of the 25th has a reputation throughout the American West, having a very violent reputation within the company. So I think it was several different factors. Yes, it was white journalism. Yes, there would have been pressurized socioeconomic forces that would have ostracized. Which part?
The socioeconomic situation at the time. You mentioned Jim Crow
Yes.
factors, and I'm surprised to hear that even here it was heavily present.
And it was heavily present in some states in the West. Montana actually tried to enact a social or segregation law, I believe in the 1890s, that actually was repealed in the 1890s as well. We do see, though, that there are significant social pressures, as in African American laborers were typically working in saloons or in warehouses, so positions that typically did not pay very well.
I guess the question is, maybe I'm taking too much time here, others might want to ask questions, but if they are predominantly working in boarding houses and brothels, what is the connection to the socioeconomic situation that prevented them from extending out to other professions, I guess is my question.
Yeah, and I will admit I'm still doing research at that point for the exact causes of the socioeconomic pressures. Mostly it was community pressures that disseminated into these socioeconomic labor positions.
I have just one more question.
Absolutely.
Okay, does this have anything to do with the connection between the fall of the Confederacy and the movement, the mass movement of Confederate supporters to the Montana Territory?
So that would have occurred in places like Helena. So Helena had a large Confederate population, with Helena once being named Confederate Gulch. So we do see actually a segregation of red light districts. There was Wood Street in Helena, which was the predominantly white district, and then there was Clore Street, which was the predominantly black district in Helena. But we do not see a large population of Confederate veterans actually moving to places like Missoula. So it would have been much more socially stratified in the capital than in Missoula. Now, I also want to mention that the 25th Infantry was only located in Montana or in Missoula for 10 years. And when those veterans came back, a lot of them moved and resided on the north side and owned a lot of their own businesses and operated businesses along West Front Street and Main Street, or Higgins, I guess. So we do see the socioeconomic conditions change after they return in 1899. Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering if you could explain what those restricted districts really were. Were they legally, was there a boundary around them? How were they restricted, and what does that mean?
Yeah, so restricted is a term that we are trying to change red light to restricted, because typically they were ostracized demographic communities or clusters of minority populations that lived not in the downtown portion of the city, but just adjacent to it. That's especially with the West Front Street district. If you go down West Front Street in West Main, that actually comprised the West Front Street district, so it was just off the downtown strip of Missoula. But what we see are red light districts often get the reputation in histories of being places of vice and sin where prostitutes lived. There was high rates of substance use or alcohol use. But we actually see, delving into the history of red light districts, it was actually ostracized demographics. So there wouldn't have been a clear boundary. You wouldn't even know that you went into the restricted district unless you knew you were going into it. In Hamilton, they did erect a wooden fence around the restricted district for privacy reasons, mostly because the restricted district in Hamilton was at once opposite a school. So they erected a really tall wooden fence to prevent the school children from seeing into the district. But the interworkings of these restricted districts were much more advanced than just places of sin. Typically, it comprised of Asian immigrant families, working women, and African American families who were pushed into these districts by typically religious reform ideologies or Victorian ideologies of keeping the public and private separate.
Okay, so you're saying restricted district is a more modern term. It's a term that you're using, or?
Yes, so
Okay.
it was used at that time as well, but not very prevalent. Usually in newspapers, we see nicknames given to red light districts like Twilight Zones, Rotten Rows, Devil's Editions, or Devil's Dens. And so red light or restricted district was used very rarely. But when we see the community as a restricted community of residents who were restricted either economically or socially or culturally from the host city, it reflects more of the diversity of these districts because we do see, families were living within these districts. There were minority-owned businesses within these districts. So it's definitely more of a complex cultural situation than just a bunch of brothels and saloons.
And I just had a couple of other things, which is there some breakdown somewhere, like in other research, where all the occupations of African Americans in Montana are shown?
Yeah, so there is the Montana Black History Project that was conducted in 2018 that actually looks at census information in 1910 and 1930 from cities across Montana. That census information is available. I don't think it has been compacted into a list at this point, but you can go through and look at the different occupations.
Because I've heard there were like 4 black newspapers in Helena at one time.
Yeah.
So many different occupations.
Yeah, so with Helena being a significantly larger city, and I will also say Helena retained a larger black population longer than Missoula due to the concentration of Buffalo soldiers at Fort Harrison. Fort Harrison was a larger fort than we were, and so they did retain a larger black population with 25th Infantry veterans settling in Helena. There were several newspapers owned by political activist Joseph Bass in Helena. Particularly, he ran the Helena Plain Dealer. I will say he was also involved in some businesses in downtown Helena, but he did have a lot of help from civil rights activist, and he was a saloon owner, Lloyd Vernon Gray. Gray started his career as an entertainment manager for black musical groups in Topeka, Kansas, and would eventually make his way to Helena, working with the Plain Dealer. But he eventually moved from Helena, Bass staying in Helena. Gray moved to California and started a black working men's club. And worked with the San Francisco Plain Dealer. He would eventually move to New York by the end of the 1920s and live in New York during the Harlem Renaissance, where there were a lot of poets, authors, newspaper publishers. So Lloyd Vernon Gray is much more representative of the larger, more intricate black community of Helena. And they did have several occupations outside of Missoula that were occupied by black laborers as well.
And lastly, just the first African-American graduate of the University of Montana Law School was named Dorsey. Was he a descendant of Solomon Dorsey?
No, okay, so James Dorsey was actually the child of Solomon Dorsey's brother, Ephraim Dorsey. So Solomon Dorsey served in the 10th Cavalry, Ephraim Dorsey served in the 25th.
I just had a quick note. I had a friend who went to the university in 1919, a woman, and she used to tell me about how she wasn't allowed to go to West Front Street at all. No university women were allowed to be on West Front Street. That's all.
Did you, with the Cold Springs and what was going on there, and it might be a jurisdictional thing where they didn't do anything about it, but was there any records that you found from the fort with that 25th that had references to what went on in Cold Springs? Like, were they punished for killing other, like, members of the military, or was that kind of restricted to just what happened on the fort grounds?
So we do see that a lot of the 25th Infantry members who did murder other 25th Infantry members, they were actually charged by the city of Missoula.
Okay, so it didn't extend outside of the fort.
Yeah,
I was
because-
wondering if there were consequences with what went on in the Army for what went on in Cold Spring.
Yeah, we do see that a lot of the murders or assaults that took place in the Cold Springs district were adjudicated by the city of Missoula.
Strictly civil, not
Yeah.
military. Okay.
Yeah, because King actually walked to to turn himself in when he killed Edward Bolton. So we do see that a lot of the commissioners also in charge of the district did conduct reports not associated with Fort Missoula.
On a slight tangent, early on you showed demographic information and the decline of Asian population and African population in Montana. There was also some interesting fluctuation in the Native American population. I was wondering if you had any information on, was there any political situation or anything that caused that, or was it just a coincidence?
I will be completely honest with you. I do not conduct tribal history. That is mostly done by tribal affiliated consultants or historians, one of which being Thompson Smith from the Confederate Salish Kootenai tribe. And so I just don't feel at liberty to answer that because I don't want to say something wrong. But I can give you Thompson Smith's email, and he would be more than happy to answer that question for you, if that's all right. Perfect.
I have a similar question. I know you can't answer it exactly. But how did they do censuses back then? Because like now, I mean, a census worker can barely get down a driveway, let alone, you know, in some subdivisions. So do you have any historical information or knowledge on how they conducted censuses?
Yeah, so census takers oftentimes would be hired by the state to do exactly what you're thinking of and walk door to door. And so we do see census takers basically made official by cities, then they go throughout the city and conduct census surveys and then report back to the state of Montana. And that's why we see a lot of misinformation in censuses, particularly names, ages, occupation. We also see this with a lot of the immigrant communities of place of origin. This is particularly rampant in the Chinese and Japanese communities because a lot of times we see census takers either attribute individuals to names because they cannot spell or pronounce the name they're given. And so this is how in Missoula we have a lot of Chinese immigrants whose name are Sam. It happens a lot. But it is because people are going door to door, going to different house numbers, assigned to different districts, responsible for reporting this survey.
Thank you. If anybody else has any further questions, feel free to go up at the end. And then next month, May, come for our next talk.